Welcome to The Writing Life, the podcast for anyone who writes. My name is Steph.
And I'm Peggy.
And we are speaking to you from the National Centre for Writing, our literature house in the heart of Norwich UNESCO City of Literature. Peggy, by the time this podcast goes out, we'll only be a few days away from Halloween, which famously a favourite time of the year for me.
I was about to say, Steph, it's a big moment to be Steph when Halloween rolls in.
Absolutely. I'm reading all my spooky books, which is actually something I just do all year round. But yeah, I can specialise in it for this month.
Very nice. You can own it.
Yes.
There's permission to...
People ask for reading recommendations and things like that this time of the year, but I'm especially...
Have you got any reading? Since you say that, is there anything brilliant that you'd want to recommend to people ahead of spooky season?
This is going to come as no surprise to you, but I have just finished the new Mariana Enriquez book, Somebody is Walking on Your Grave, which is
fresh from our event with her.
From our event with her, no less, which was wonderful. And that's a non-fiction book. It's her first non-fiction book in English translation, and it is all about graveyards of the world, which sounds very morbid, but actually it's very, very fascinating.
But she's very witty company, both in person and on the page, so it sort of belies this the subject matter.
Absolutely, yeah. She's very charming and very funny. And there's a lot in that book about fandom as well, and sort of acts of devotion and pilgrimages. I think it's really rich and really fascinating. So I think that's deeply biased, of course, and we've talked about this a lot for the past week or so, but that would be my recommendation for this Halloween. I can't imagine you read any spooky books, is it? You've read a few.
I'm far too much of a fearedy cat, as we would say. I'm a little fearedy cat when it comes to scary things. So no, not really. But I suppose a recommendation that might be seasonal, and I think I can spoil that we are in fact having this author come to us later in the year, is The Lost Folk by Lally Macbeth. And that is a beautiful book, and it does have some things around Halloween and around kind of folk custom and tradition. And I just heartily recommend it if you're interested in anything to do with place, memory, collective histories, tradition, music, folk art. It's packed full. It's beautiful, and really pleased to say that Lally is coming to do an event with us in December. Yeah. So a little teaser there.
Can't wait. I'm really excited for that, actually. Yeah, it's just in time for Christmas, which feels like a great season to be talking about folk tales and British folklore. And that idea of folklore not just being like a historical concept, but actually, the folklore of the future and what the rituals that we develop now and how exactly. It just sounds great.
It's beautiful, exactly that. It's not a thing, it's a living idea, really. That book's all about that.
That's on my to-read pile, so I'll be reading that next.
Gorge.
And actually, speaking of events that we've got coming up that feel quite seasonally fitting, we have 5 events happening at Dragon Hall here as part of Norwich Book Festival in late October. So most of the events are on the 25th and the 26th of October that weekend. And the first event is Bog People, and it's an anthology launch for a book called Bog People, and it's all about British working class horror short stories, so tied into folklore and folk horror and things like that, which I think is going to be absolutely fantastic, followed by an evening event with Sarah Hall to launch her new novel Helm, which is all about, it's very elemental, I think, very mythical, so there's a bit of a running theme here, I think. And then on the Sunday, the 26th of October, we've got Laura Purcell, who is bringing her new novel, House of Splinters, to Norwich. And that is a follow-on from her very, very popular novel, The Silent Companions, which is a ghost story. And then finally, on Sunday afternoon, we have an event all about mysticism in West African and Caribbean stories with Celeste Mohammed. So, yeah, can't wait for that weekend, actually. It's jam-packed. And actually, the whole festival, which runs throughout Norwich for a week or so, looks, absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, folklore, we are leaning in.
Big folklore energy over here at the moment. We've had Bog People summer, and now we're into folklore autumn.
And Steph, who are we speaking to on the podcast this time?
We have Sarah Moss on the podcast. I'm very excited
with
about
your good
this.
self.
I know, with my good self.
What are we talking about?
Living the dream. Firstly, we had the immense pleasure of hosting Sarah for an event back in May at Norfolk and Norwich Festival. She was in conversation with Erica Hesketh, who is a fantastic chair, and they were discussing her latest novel, Ripeness, which came out earlier in the year. And we enjoyed her discussion so much that we had to have her on the podcast as well. Sarah has written several novels, including the Sunday Times top 10 bestseller, Summerwater and Ghost Wall, which was longlisted for the Women's Prize. She's also written 2 works of memoir, Names for the Sea, an account of her year living in Iceland, and My Good Bright Wolf. So my conversation with Sarah focused on Ripeness, her new novel, and the process of writing the book. And we covered a huge amount of ground, including dual narrative, because the book is told through the perspective of one character, but at 2 different stages of her life. So Edith as a child, and then Edith as an older lady in her 70s. We talked about the relationship between words and actions, including the use of dancing and movement in the book, the importance of flawed characters, and the role of fiction during times of socio-political upheaval. Sarah is exceptionally thoughtful and very intelligent. I absolutely loved speaking to her. I could just listen to her talk forever, actually. She's got such wonderful ideas. So I hope that everyone else enjoys my conversation with her too.
I absolutely love Sarah Moss's work, so I am equally invested in hearing this gorgeous conversation. So let's just hand over to Steph, speaking with Sarah Moss about her novel, Ripeness.
Sarah, welcome to the Writing Life podcast. It's a pleasure to speak with you today.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
And we're going to talk about your latest novel, Ripeness, which is described as a breathtaking story of love and the search for belonging from 1960s Italy to present-day Ireland. And I have to say, it's a very, very moving read. It's the kind of book that left me with a lump in my throat as I read those final few pages. It's absolutely beautiful. So I can't wait to discuss it with you. But before we dive in, we've been talking a lot on The Writing Life and at National Centre for Writing this year about writing habits and writing routines. And as someone with 9 novels, I think now, and several works of memoir and non-fiction under her belt, what does your writing routine look like?
I always find this a funny question, maybe less so now than I did when my children were younger. But for most of my writing life, the answer was it looked like having a reasonable belief that nobody would interrupt me for the next 10 minutes.
Of course. Fiction starts.
Yes. So all of that stuff where people say, I ascend to my library and I close the green baize door and instruct the butler not to disturb me for 3 hours was just hilarious to me. And that was never going to happen.
Just seems impossible, doesn't it? It just seems like an impossible fantasy when people say things like that. Do you have a routine now? Does it look like is there more of a rhythm to when and where you write now?
I've been thinking about this recently because I feel as if there's a shift as my children get older. They're both now technically adults. And I'm very reluctant to allocate any of this kind of midlife change to hormones. I think that's a really reductive and misogynist way of thinking about it. But there's been a shift over the last few years into a different kind of relationship with my own time and with how I think. And I feel as if I'm thinking in longer arcs and quite often working in longer arcs. And I think some of that is just not being interrupted as much, just that nobody's going to come and say, Mummy, I need a biscuit or I need the loo or something's fallen off something. But it does also feel to me like a life stage or something about my own maturity. And I'm quite curious about it.
Yeah. And you're a teacher as well, aren't you? Or you're a professor of creative...
University lecturer. Yeah.
Yeah. How does teaching creative writing influence the way you write? Does it have an impact?
Yes, it's always been a virtuous circle for me. A lot of people who teach and write find them in conflict and find it difficult to write while teaching. For me, fortunately, because I've always done both, the work of talking about books in the classroom has always really fueled the work of writing them around that. And I will quite often find that ideas are crossing over from my teaching into my writing and the other way around. So I like it.
Yeah. Do you teach non-fiction as well as...
I do. I like teaching non-fiction because you can think about it on a slightly smaller scale. It's much less intimidating than saying, right now we shall write a novel.
Yeah. I imagine you can break it into parts.
Absolutely. And a lot of the techniques that you develop with non-fiction are really, really supportive for fiction, and maybe a little bit less the other way around, I think. I do, and I like it.
Does teaching non-fiction have an effect on your fiction writing at all? Is there any?
No more than all teaching and probably everything that happens has an effect on my writing. I mean, those conversations in the classroom certainly fuel my writing and my reading and my thinking.
So Sarah, let's talk about Ripeness. And I wanted to start with the structure of the novel, which is, it has this dual narrative. So we're following Edith, who is a 17-year-old girl with 4 passports, and she's traveling to Italy to help her pregnant sister. And then we also have Edith again at 73, living in Ireland and feeling at once more comfortable with her life, but also still an outsider. Can you tell us about this dual narrative and what drew you to it, and what possibilities did it open up for you when you were writing about Edith?
So Edith is the generation of my parents and teachers. I mean, she's the generation that was the grown-ups for me, and maybe in some ways still is. I'm not sure about that. And I was thinking in the most general terms about their cultural project. I mean, that whole post-war project of liberal democracy, and the way I think a lot of us feel that it's failing now and it's falling apart. And I wanted to think about her at the beginning of that and at the end. You know, she's been politically active. She's politically active in her 20s and 30s particularly, and now in her 70s, having moved to the west of Ireland, she's feeling as if she did her best, she did her part, and it's not the way the world is going. So then what does a good life look like? How can you be happy in your 70s? And for her, that's partly about having just got divorced, a good and happy divorce. So I was really interested in the bracketing of those years and what happens if you hold the 17-year-old up to the 73-year-old without the whole story in between. And of course, the story in between trickles in. She doesn't have 4 passports when she's 17, but she does by the time she's 73.
Yes.
Yeah. Of course, that's partly to do with the life that she's lived along the way and the people she's lived with and the places she's been. So, yeah, I was thinking about different kinds of outsiderishness. I mean, growing up in her village in the Peak District, her mother is French and Jewish. So they're always, although she has a sense of coming from there, she's growing up on a farm that belongs to father, they're still not really integrated in village life, particularly when her sister moves to London to be a ballet dancer. And then in Ireland, she will never belong, she will never be an insider because she's English, although not entirely English and not straightforwardly English. So I was interested in what it's like for those of us, and this is certainly partly me, who don't have those kinds of tribal identities and a genetic sense of belonging to a particular place.
And how did your approach to Edith's voice, how does her voice change when you were writing her as a teenager compared to an older woman?
Well, of course, that's one of the main challenges of the narrative, because she needs to be the same person, but also different in the ways different. I do this with all of my kind of two-handed novels. I wrote it the way you read it. So I didn't write one narrative and then break it up and write another narrative. I really wanted the writing as well as the reading to have that back and forth movement. And once I'd settled in her voice, I pretty much trusted my process, which is what I think you have to. There's no alternative. I mean, it's not that your process will always be trustworthy, but there isn't really an alternative to trusting it and seeing what happens.
Fascinating. And I was looking online at kind of reviews and reactions to Ripeness, and one reviewer had said that Ripeness was more politically muted than, say, the flawed Summerwater. I thought that was fascinating, really, because for me, the novel's politics are everywhere. They're embedded everywhere. They're in everyday thoughts and choices and gestures. So would you agree with that reviewer's assessment when you were writing the book? How did you think about allowing the politics to sort of surface throughout the narrative?
I don't really think about it. I let it happen.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, there is no apolitical life. There's no apolitical way of being. And often when students say things like, I'm not interested in politics, or I'm not interested in history is the other line, I think, well, politics and history are definitely interested in you. Yeah. And actually, the less interested you are in politics and history, the more interested politics and history are in you. So you better get interested, sweetie. So yes, of course, the politics are there all the way through. I suspect what that kind of review means is that the politics are worn less lightly, or it's more ambivalent.
Yeah. There's kind of, I love the way that Edith's stream of consciousness veers from, she's thinking about migrancy and identity and assimilation as she's putting the sheets in the wash on a warm day. It's kind of those passing thoughts that, as you say, that they're in the everyday. They're in everything that we do, but they're, I guess, maybe not as explicitly referred to all the time.
Yes. And because it's not set in Britain, it's not in my country, whatever I mean by that. It's less overtly about national politics.
Yeah. And it's a novel about words, of course, but it's also a story about movement and action and talking about sort of politics as a loose term, the things that are directly and indirectly expressed. And there's so much that of what characters in this book say or don't say, as well as what they think or how they act. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about your approach to the relationship between words and actions in this book, because there's quite a gap between how different characters express themselves through movement and action versus what can be expressed through what they say.
Yes, that's partly a long-term interest in novels about people who are not necessarily wordy or don't express themselves clearly verbally. And of course, in some ways, it's very easy to write fiction about people who are super articulate and constantly examining their lives and articulating everything that the reader might want to know about them. But most people are not like that. And a lot of the most interesting stories are not like that. And I've been interested for a long time in narratives of embodiment. And I always find it really hard to talk about this because it's increasingly obvious to me that the whole idea of the brain-body division is just mad. I mean, brains are bodies. They are material. They run on the same stuff as the rest of your body. Your feet and your brain are running on exactly the same fuel that's coming from exactly the same places. So that whole Cartesian idea about mind and body being somehow separate, I mean, when they're separate, you're dead. That's a pretty good definition of death. So in some ways, it seems very odd to talk about the writing of embodiment because there is nothing else. We don't exist outside and beyond our bodies. And yet it still feels as if bodily experience isn't always as central to fiction as it is to lived experience. And it probably can't be. I mean, that's just one of the differences between reality and realism. But I'm always interested in that. And that's one of the reasons for the centrality of dance to this novel. Because in the same way that in Ghost Wall, I was interested in prehistory, which is not lives without words, but it's lives that leave no linguistic record. I mean, when you think about prehistoric people, we very often have access to the places they lived, the food they ate, the things they handled, the jewelry they made and wore. You can quite often imagine landscape the way they must have seen it, but we have no idea what their words were. We have no way of beginning to imagine that. And that was one of the central fascinations of Ghost Wall. And similarly, dance is a form of expression at least as ornate and important as writing and probably much older, but one that leaves no trace. It's wordless. It's about forms of expression that are not verbal. So how do you write about that? And that was one of the questions that kept drawing me back into this novel.
Yeah, there's a brilliant bit, isn't there? I think where Edith asks, "Can we think or speak of our bodies without metaphor?" And so is that a challenge for you as a writer? Do you have an impulse to resist metaphor when you're writing about the body? You're trying to find other ways to, what's that experience like?
I'm just curious. I don't think I have an impulse to resist metaphor. Maybe the opposite. Maybe I'm always looking for exactly the right one. I was thinking that's where Edith's in a yoga class, and I do a lot of yoga. And when I started doing it, I found some of the ways yoga teachers talk about the body just bizarre. They'll say things like breathe into your left knee, and you think, oh, come off it. I know where my lungs are and they're not in my left knee. But the more you do it, the more sense it seems to make.
It kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Yeah,
yes.
It's funny.
Yes, I do feel as if I can now breathe into my left knee.
I can breathe into my hips and my pelvis. Yeah,
that's right. Yes. And of course you can't. I mean, obviously you can't. Everything we know about anatomy makes that perfectly clear. And yet also you can. And that's metaphor somehow taking us into our body in ways that literal language can't. I mean, literally you cannot breathe into your knee. And somehow metaphorically, when someone tells you to, when it's part of your practice, you can. So there is some really knotty, really interesting relationship there between words and the body that goes both ways, right? The words that you use for your body take you into your body in ways that without those words, you couldn't move. And I was thinking also about instructions, the way we direct the body. And when Lydia, Edith's sister, is giving birth, she's able to move in exactly the way the midwife tells her to, because she's used to being told how to move her body. It makes intuitive sense to her. So there were all of these moments where the relationship between words and the body is not only much closer than we tend to imagine it, but not necessarily going in the direction that we tend to imagine either. So what happens if we write about that? How can you get in there in not only in verbal direction and instruction, but in text?
Yeah. And you mentioned Lydia, who is, as you say, a ballet dancer, and you've touched on dance being a huge part of this book and a part of the bodily and movement. And I think there's a point where Lydia says that Edith is the one that's good with words. So I guess by comparison, Lydia's the one that sort of expresses herself through movement. And Edith often reflects on what it means for women to move, to take up space, but also the way in which dance can be considered a trap for girls, them to be, controlled or contained. There's a sources section at the back of the book, isn't there, that lists lots of dance-related books that you read. I just thought, could you talk a little bit more about the use of dance in the book and why that spoke so powerfully as a metaphor for you?
I'm not sure it's exactly a metaphor. I think it's a way of thinking about art and narrative and pattern and expression and stories told with the body rather than in sentences. And I've always liked ballet. I mean, my own ballet career was over by the time I was 8. I don't have that kind of body and I'm terrible at which is left and which is right. So it was never going to work. But I've always loved watching it and always been a bit ambivalent about my love of watching it, because in some ways, particularly the traditional dances, are so much about a kind of hyper-femininity of which I'm deeply distrustful. I mean, you have to be very thin and very small and very light and very delicate, and men have to be able to carry you about. And yet there's so much power in it. One of the moments of beginning for this book was a photo of Margot Fonteyn on holiday with the Lee Firmers, another kind of famous literary family in Greece in the 1960s. And she's lying on her back, naked, with her eyes closed, in the middle of a ruined amphitheatre. And it should be a photo of a woman in a state of great vulnerability, because the photographer, who was actually Joan Lee Firmer, another woman, is standing over her, looking down on her, prone, naked, eyes closed. Margot Fonteyn is in total command of that image and of the amphitheatre and probably the entire landscape for several miles around. There's just something about her pose, about the way she's holding herself, that's absolutely powerful, even although she's naked and lying on the ground on her back and presumably surrounded by clothed people who are taking pictures of her. So there's that ambivalence in ballet where it's both centered on female power and strength and feeling, and yet there is so much pain, suffering and hunger and smallness involved in it. And that those hinge points, those moments where things are both and, always really interest me.
Yeah. And that's certainly something that I picked up on a lot in this novel and in your writing, how things are contrasting and complementary at the same time. So there's, autonomy and submissiveness, there's sort of freedom and control. And it very much points to that there not being a clear sense of, right and wrong, or of direct meaning, or that an action or a thought can mean one thing and contradict itself as something else at the same time. Is that something that you're thinking about as you're writing? It's something that you're really interested in, that ability for something to be more than one thing at once?
Always. Yes, absolutely. And not only when I'm writing, I mean, almost all the time. And it makes it increasingly hard as I get older to have strong opinions about things, because I do perceive ambivalence and complexity and obscurity. And sometimes, in some cases, it's perfectly obvious what any decent person ought to think about a thing, but often I can see both sides in ways that I couldn't when I was younger.
And thinking about Edith's character, or Edith as I don't want to say a flawed character, because she, it's not something that, but there's some readers who have expressed sort of, frustration or disappointment with Edith's older self in particular, because she has quite strong reflections on belonging and identity and migration, but she doesn't necessarily act on them in particular moments. She's quite passive to the state of things. And there seems to be an expectation from some readers that they need Edith to do the right thing. How do you respond to that expectation? It's what place do flawed characters have in your work?
I find it quite interesting, and I wonder how much it's gendered, because I think that older male writers can write really quite unlikable older male characters. And it's just interesting. And it's fine that the character is dislikable, or they're curmudgeonly, or they're quite frankly wrong about some things. And for Edith, and I think maybe for other central female characters, they don't seem to have the same latitude, or the writers don't quite have the same latitude to write somebody who's not always likable and does get things wrong and is passive when she should be active, and maybe sometimes active when she should be passive. I always meant her to be flawed, as we all are, but also as a representative of a generation who changed lots of really important things in really important ways that we inherit, and yet whose overall, and of course I'm speaking in the most general terms here, but whose overall project of post-war liberal democracy seems to be coming apart, hasn't worked. I mean, growing up in the 90s, and I think most of my contemporaries thought that this gospel of correct living and correct politics would just spread around the world, and then everybody would be enlightened and we would all live happily ever after. That's what you think when you're 17. But I don't think it was just the teenagers. I think there was a general sense that in Europe we kind of got it right, and gradually everybody else in the world would get it right, and then we would all be fine. Absolute abject colonial imperialist nonsense. But at the time it seemed to be true, and now we're really seeing the wheels come off it. So I mean her to be like that, to be somebody who has campaigned and marched and demonstrated, but from a perspective that we might now see as quite limited. And not necessarily wrong as far as it goes, but wrong in thinking that it goes further than it goes.
Of course, yeah.
So yes, I don't mean her to be right. And also I've talked about this with other friends who've emigrated. There is something quite infantilizing about emigration, where it's not your country and it's not your politics, and your voice is not the one that should be heard. And you can become quite passive in ways that you might not be if you felt that you had a right to speak up and that it belonged to you.
Yeah, and Edith sort of constantly berates herself, doesn't she, in that older voice, and says, this isn't about me, or this isn't about, there's, lots of those moments.
There's an interesting literature of complicity, which is one of the places I would situate it. I mean, if you look at white South African writing or some Israeli writing, a lot of German post-war writing, what is it like to inherit guilt for things you did not yourself do? And that's a very present question if you're English in Ireland.
And of course, these questions don't have a single answer, do they? So just like Edith is not going to have a single answer. In your writing, do you think it's more important for you to almost, hold up a mirror so that we can, as readers, see ourselves as we are, or rather than offering, a reader a sense of sort of clarity or direction or resolution, some kind of answer as they're reading? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I'm going to sort of separate that into two things. I think I sometimes talk to students about novels as windows and novels as mirrors.
Got you.
And I think they're all both. I think when we think about, do we see ourselves in a novel? Is it a mirror? That is one of the jobs that fiction can do. The mirror needs different lighting, but, are we seeing something in the mirror that we don't see without the mirror? On the other hand, that we and that mirror are both quite dangerous ways of thinking, because we who exactly? We women, we middle-aged women, we middle-aged middle-class white women. How specific do we want to be about that we? So I think all novels can be both mirrors and windows. And that's hugely important when we think about translated fiction, or what's sometimes rather worryingly called global fiction or world literature, which I think has the same problem as any binary division of literature. It's not world literature. We're all writing world literature. We're all reading world literature. So just to kind of confuse the mirror question a little bit. And then the thinking about resolution, I think one of the reasons I love realist fiction so much is the ways in which it's totally unrealistic. Yeah. And one of those is its promise of an ending. And the ending doesn't have to be a fabulous comedy or tragedy, and it must not be too beautifully tied up. But there is a contract with the reader. Come with me, come into this story. And the promise is that there will be an ending, which in real life there is not. Real life is absolutely deficient in endings. Things end all over the place in messy and inconclusive and meaningless ways that bring no satisfaction whatsoever. But in fiction, I promise you, there will be an ending. They probably won't live happily ever after, and we probably won't have flights of angels descending, but there will be an ending. And I love that about fiction. It's one of the hardest things to do, because if your writing is essentially realist, the ending is the most unrealistic moment. But I really love it. I love the form of the thing. So it's another kind of both and answer, where the abject messiness of real life does not work on the page. And yet, if you're writing realist fiction, you have some loyalty to the abject messiness of real life, but you also have a loyalty to the form of the novel, which means that there will be narrative structure, and there will be a beginning, and there will be an ending.
Yeah. Do you find endings quite difficult to write then in your own books?
Yeah.
Are they one of the hardest bits?
Yes. Yes, they are harder than beginnings, I think, because you need to find that very narrow space between the unrealistic happily ever after and the unsatisfactorily realistic, right, we're stopping here.
So it's a book that Ripeness deals with thematically a lot, and there are some very moving moments, there are some very heavy themes at play, but there is also lightness and humour in your writing. And as a reading experience, despite maybe having some sort of heavy subject matter, it never feels like a heavy book to read. So I wondered, how do you think about bringing lightness into your writing when you're tackling quite difficult themes? Do you consciously consider the role of humour in striking that balance? No, not at all.
No, not at all. It's again about trusting the process. I think I do absolutely love the world and life and being alive. And I just need to write with that.
Yeah.
And I also see darkness and trouble and violence and the awful things that people want to do to each other and the awful things that people do to each other. So again, I'm saying it's a both and. I mean, I know in some ways I'm seen as quite a dark writer, and I'm certainly interested in darkness, but I'm equally interested in light.
Yeah, I think they absolutely go hand in hand, don't they? And I know that even from personal experience, some of the darkest parts of my life have always at the same time had some of the most brilliant and amazing and beautiful aspects to them at the same time.
Yeah. I think there's a terrible beauty in the darkest experiences, and not that you would wish them on anybody or want them, but I have seen people grieve beautifully.
Yeah, absolutely. And is writing about the natural world a place of lightness for you?
Not always, no. I grew up doing a lot of hiking and mountain climbing and a very kind of purist, unequipped kind of sailing. And a lot of that was about risk assessment and risk management and knowing where the danger was and how to avoid it. And I liked that. I enjoyed it then, and I'm probably less into danger now than I used to be. In fact, I know exactly when I stopped being into danger. But I always found it quite exciting and enjoyed it. I wouldn't say I'd ever been exactly an adrenaline junkie, but there's something very satisfying in knowing the group that you're taking into the hills, knowing what their limits are, being able to say, actually, no, we're going back now. That's it. Or being able to say, okay, we're going on a bit, but if this thing happens, then we'll go back. But I've never had that. I think Kathleen Jamie called it otters and daffodils. There's somewhere where she says it's not all otters and daffodils. And I never thought it was all otters and daffodils. If you do a lot of mountain climbing, you're always aware of the danger as well, because we're in bodies and our bodies are vulnerable, like all other animal bodies.
Yeah. And continuing on that thread, talking about bodies and the bodily, food appears a lot throughout Edith's story as well. So there's her fascination with the kitchen stuff in Italy, to dancing and pie making with her grandmother, the preparation of traditional Ukrainian food. Can you talk about the role of food in the novel and what the act of preparing or sharing meals allowed you to explore?
Yeah, sure. I've always been interested in the writing of that kind of domestic work. And I think in my earlier books, in a different kind of publishing landscape, that was sometimes seen as being boring. Oh God, she keeps writing about the laundry. Right, who does your laundry then, mate? Because we keep doing the laundry. Yeah. It's a daily practice in my house. We have 4 people and 3 of us are pretty sporty, and there's a lot of laundry, and we all spend a certain amount of time doing the laundry. So let's write about that then. And my relationship with food has not been straightforward for most of my life, but I've always been fascinated by and always loved cooking and eating because it's so elemental and elementary. And I was talking earlier about how your brain and your feet run on the same fuel. Well, that fuel is your food. And in The Fell, once a reader said to me, oh, you're writing about this character who lives on land, meaning somebody who grows their own kale in a vegetable garden. And I said, we all live on the land. Where do you think it comes from? How do you think it works? And in some ways, it goes back to my scholarly interest in romanticism. I mean, it's interesting now that we tend to think of those poets as being very disembodied and floaty, but they're absolutely not. They're really interested in growing food, looking after animals, cooking, eating, and then taking that energy out into the landscape. But they're actually very embodied kinds of poetry and writing and ways of thinking about writing. And one of the texts I've returned to all my life is Dorothy Wordsworth's journals, because they're a bit jumbled, but when you read that jumble seriously, there's a real real project there where she writes about picking the apples, making a pie, writing a poem, staying up late, translating Chaucer, transcribing one of Wordsworth's poems, getting a headache, going to bed. There's no separation there between the practices of art and the practices of domesticity. They're understood as absolutely symbiotic, which in the most literal sense they are. I mean, symbiosis, living together, living through. So I'm interested in food and cooking as culture, as care, as labour, as pleasure. They're all of those things.
And you've spoken before about, or I seem to remember when I attended your event back in May, you spoke about the act of writing and the act of feeding as well, which I thought was really interesting. Can you expand on that?
I've thought about ways in which culture and society think about reading and eating and cooking and writing, and particularly the anxieties around women's eating and women's reading, which run together through maybe a little bit less now, but for a very long time, reading fiction and eating were both seen as kind of suspicious, self-indulgent, private pleasures that were quite dangerous to women's virtue and self-control. And I quite like that, let's go eat chocolate and read novels in private. Yeah. It's an excellent way of spending the time.
Yeah. And Edith's a very bookish character, I guess. She makes lots of literary references throughout this book, from Sylvia Plath to Bronte and Shakespeare, of course. Why did you choose to weave those references into her stream of consciousness?
I just let myself do it because she's of a generation that would plausibly have that kind of knowledge, which I do because I had a very traditional education. So I'm always hearing echoes of what I now reluctantly acknowledge to be the dead white male canon, which should not be the entire body of education. But for me, it was. I mean,
of course, yeah.
It was just because of the places I went to school and the places I went to university. It was a problem, very definitely, the exclusion of women and everybody else. But you can't say the dead white male canon isn't utterly beautiful. I mean, it might be politically wrong and it might be excluding all kinds of other things, but my answer to that is always more rather than less, rather than not reading dead white men, let's read a whole load of everybody else as well, because they're all in conversation. So like Edith, I carry a lot of poetry with me in my mind, and I sort of want to say in my heart, which is very old-fashioned of me, but I will go with it. So I hear it and I see it, and there are echoes for me all the time, everywhere. And it was just quite fun to let Edith have some of that.
And so the title Ripeness refers to a line from Shakespeare's King Lear, and there's also references to Hamlet. How do the lines from those two plays kind of speak to the wider themes of the novel? Why did you pick those?
So it's a thought that I've had for years. I mean, actually, Edith remembers writing it in her A-level exam, and actually I wrote it in my A-level exam. I just nicked that bit directly from life. Paper on Shakespearean tragedy. And in Hamlet, the readiness is all. And in Lear, ripeness is all. And I've always thought Lear is one of those one of those plays for me that survived doing it both at A-level and at university. It's so dark and complicated, and it has a bleakness of vision that even the other Shakespeare tragedies don't quite, I think. And when I was 18, I thought about it very differently, but now I think about ripeness and I think about readiness. And readiness is about being prepared, being well advised. I mean, it's from the Anglo-Saxon for to be well advised. So you can choose to be ready. I mean, that whole thing about fortune favours the prepared. You can marshal it. It can be part of your equipment. But ripeness is just something that comes to us if we're lucky. And you can't make it happen. I mean, antics with bananas in paper bags notwithstanding, there's nothing you can do to make things ripen or to make yourself ripen. It just comes with time. And Edith is probably more ripe than ready in later life. And I think one of the things that some readers find annoying about her is that she's ripe more than ready. She's not about to do anything very much. She's just thinking about things. And then, of course, also there's the very different ripeness of a 17-year-old on the cusp of womanhood, surrounded by fruit that she's encountering for the first time. Lydia about to have a baby. There's some quite literal forms of ripeness. But yeah, I was thinking about agency and its limit.
And it seems impossible not to mention one particular subplot about migrants being housed in a hotel in Ireland. And of course, this book came out a few months ago, and I'm sure you were writing it months or years before that. But in this particular moment, as we talk, that is such a huge thing. Could not be more prescient. Broadly, what role do you think fiction can play during moments of political, societal upheaval? What do you hope? Is there a hope that I guess more broadly, fiction will broadly, but also your books in particular? Is there anything that you hope people will take away from your writing?
I think that art cannot be activism, and that's really important to me. I think you can be an artist and an activist in the same way that you can be an artist and a doctor, or an artist and a cleaner, or a shop assistant, or whatever else you might be. But they're not the same thing, because art's commitment must be to complexity and ambivalence and uncertainty, and those things are not admissible in activism. So I would insist very firmly that if you really want to change the world, then don't write a novel. That's not. No war was ever ended by a novelist. No act of parliament ever came about because of a novel. And I think even if you look at the 19th century and think about Dickens and Gaskell and child labour, it helps, but it's as much a reflection as anything else. I hope it goes without saying that I am firmly on the side of immigration, welcome and refugees. I mean, my own family background, apart from anything else, would make it absurd for me to be anything else. But I think that if art changes the world, it's in subtle and long-range ways that individual artists don't control. And of course, there's the much quoted Shelley dictum about poets being the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Yeah, tell that to somebody with a tank.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I represent what I see, but I don't think that writing novels is any form of activism, or should be, or that good novels are written out of activism.
I guess art has the power to change a person's life, maybe an individual's outlook, or, through the experience of reading that book or viewing that painting. But as you say, on a much larger scale, it complements rather than enacts radical change.
And I think to the extent that art changes people's minds, it's subtle and it's cumulative. It's not that one particular, maybe sometimes somebody will read one particular book and change their mind about one particular subject, but I'd be surprised. And frankly, I don't think most of the people who are protesting outside hostels are reading a lot of literary fiction or going to a lot of art galleries.
Yeah, true. And I guess if people are, choosing not to sort of engage with what they see on the TV, or, believing that some of the facts that they're being told are, lies or fake news, I mean, it's going to be even harder to get them to change their perspective based on a book or a song or a movie.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wish it were true, but I don't think it is or can be.
So, Sarah, before we wrap up, what's next for you? Are you working on a writing project at the moment?
Yeah, I am. I'm working on another novel.
Brilliant. There's that's all you can say. I can absolutely tell.
There's a loud silence there.
Yes, there is. Oh, I can't wait to read it.
Thank you.
And it's been so fantastic to speak to you as well. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. No, I've really enjoyed it. Brilliant question.
Thank you.
Wow, a big thank you to Sarah Moss for her time, and to Steph. If you have any questions or you want to get in touch, you can find us at Writer Centre on Instagram and Blue Sky. We're on Facebook, and you can sign up to the NCW newsletter by visiting nationalcenterforwriting.org.uk.
As a UK registered charity, we rely on the generosity of our supporters to make our work possible. You can make a donation today over on our website by clicking on the Support Us button.
And if you enjoyed what you heard today, please do consider subscribing to the podcast and leaving a rating and a review wherever you get your podcasts, because this really helps other writers and listeners to find us.
5-star ratings only. Thanks again, everyone. Keep writing, and we will catch you on the next episode.